I am very happy to be here. This is an organization that I have long admired, respected, benefited from, so I thank you for the invitation. Please, if you are still eating, I have no audio visual, there are no graphics. You don't have to look at me. Don't twist yourself around. Please continue to eat and don't worry about Ocado. I spent 32 years speaking to people on the floor of the House of Representatives, and if you've watched that, you know I was getting varying degrees of attention. So there is no problem. I once was speaking and a baby started to cry, and I said, to be honest, that talking while the baby was crying was not nearly as disruptive as talking while Newt Gingrich was listening. So I want you to feel relaxed. I'm actually going to be picking up to a certain extent where I left off in the comment that Peter Evers asked me to make, and that is I think there may not, I think there is not a sufficient understanding of the enormous upheaval, I would say, in the political culture of this country that's taken place. It's an extraordinary election year. Now, obviously, the antics of the Republican candidates in particular have taken a lot of that attention, and I should say I apologize. I did ask that I be able to speak before you all through. I am meeting some friends for dinner tonight at the Trump Tower, and I do want to get there on time. But there is a tendency, obviously, to continue in the political change, and particularly in America, doesn't happen rapidly. But I think it has changed drastically, and people want to ask me questions when we get to the question period, and it may be about the financial reform bill, which I would tell you I refer to it as the financial reform bill, and not by the name that it is most commonly used, because in the history of the world, I think people who refer to themselves in the third person come across as kind of pompous twits. The only human being I have ever observed be able to refer to himself in the third person and not look a little bit ridiculous was Charles de Gaulle. Not being General de Gaulle, and not wanting to raise my arms over my head, I'm going to refer to it as the financial reform bill. But I think that in the interpretation of what's going to happen going forward, there's been a failure to understand this. And that's why I titled my talk, The Year That Class Warfare Became Respectable. For many years, those of us who have been trying to put some attention on the distribution of wealth in America have been told that we are just wrong, that that's class warfare. We don't do that in America. All we needed to do was to focus on growth. And that was made very explicit. There was a metaphor that was used. I would tell you, I'm a great believer in free speech. I think people ought to be able to call each other names. And I think the response ought to be to young people whose feelings have been hurt that they should get over it. But with regard to free speech, if I were to make, there are two changes I would make. One, I would make it a misdemeanor to use the words pragmatic and idealistic as if they were opposed. They're either interrelated or you're irrelevant. But I would also, I'd make it a felony to use metaphors in the discussion of public policy. Now, that's especially the case in foreign policy. But what happens is, in my experience, people start debating the metaphor as if it was reality. And there was a metaphor that was very, very compelling here. The rising tide will lift all boats. John Kennedy actually said it, which gave the right wing some leverage in citing it. And the argument was that if you simply work to increase the overall economic output, that will make everybody better off. And therefore, you should not engage in public policies that seek to alter the distribution. One, because it's not very necessary, and in fact, it's counterproductive, because you will be interfering with incentives, and you will, the argument was that if you began to worry about the distribution, you would be putting a drag on the overall increase, and the overall increase would take care of things. Now, obviously, this is an example. You start debating, and yes, the rising tide does lift all boats. I know that because I represented the most lucrative fishing port in America, the city of New Bedford, and I could see the rising tide go up and down with the boats. But the economy is not a tide, people are not boats. In fact, I tried to get into the metaphoric spirit by pointing out that if you are standing in the water on your tiptoes because you're too poor to afford a boat, the rising tide goes up your nose. I.e., if you don't have a boat and you're in an area where everybody's getting richer, you're worse off. But that was still, it was frustrating. That argument that class warfare was un-American and counterproductive and unnecessary, all three, was a serious problem. For much of my tenure in Congress, one of my greatest frustrations was the popular support that existed for repealing the estate tax, a tax which affected a tiny sliver of people. But you had this, I can be rich someday, and that's not what we do. As an example of the shift I'm talking about, that's over. What's striking about this year, and obviously the personalities, very interesting personalities in both fields. I mean, it is very clear, whoever gets elected president this year will be a person who 20 years ago could not have been elected for one reason or another: gender, age, ideology, commitment to rationality. There are a series of things that would have been a bar that appear no longer to be. But as you look at that, look at the underlying argument. And this is the year in which we have written the obituary for the notion that worrying about the distribution of income is class warfare and unacceptable. And I can't overestimate the extent to which many of us were frustrated by this. It was clearly the Republican side, but it was sort of a lot of the Democrats believe that too. And it's pretty much over. Obviously, on the Democratic side, there is a agreement between Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton that we need to do more to deal with the unfairness of the distribution. But what confirms it is even on the Republican side, and not just with Donald Trump. The Republicans, it's happened because the Republicans faced a real dilemma this year in campaigning against Obama. And it is that the American economy, as your brochure said, has done better than any other developed world economy since the crisis, and in fact, it's the crisis that Obama inherited. Well, what do you do if you are a Republican campaigning against the party which has presided over a very good overall economic pattern of growth? And interestingly, the answer is to stress that the growth has not been fairly shared. And that's what's really quite striking, that if you listen to the Republican rhetoric, they are also engaging in what used to be called class warfare, namely, in fact, denigrating the importance of overall economic growth and saying, no, that's not valid. We need to do more to alter the shares. Now, I am, as a Democrat, long-term optimistic, and as a liberal who wants to see government used even more as an instrument for social interventions and economic interventions, I'm optimistic for two reasons. One is that the Republicans have gotten themselves in such a terrible situation. But two, the fact that we have this agreement now that overall economic growth is not enough, and that in fact you have to focus on how you make sure the growth is more fairly shared. In almost every instance, that's a Democratic argument. That is, every public policy that would be relevant to dealing with the distribution is our issue. I do not understand how, now in the primary campaign, when people on the Republican side are appealing to each other, it's one thing. But if you are the Republican nominee or you're a Republican senator or representative going forward, I'll tell you two arguments that are hard to make simultaneously. One, we have not done enough to see that lower income people and middle income people have participated, that too much of the increase has gone to the very rich. Two, let's reduce taxes on the very rich. That's a very difficult tightrope to walk. Let's not do the minimum wage. Let's not make it easier for people to go to school. The terms of the debate have shifted. Now, this frustration for me was that for many years, even where the Democratic position, the liberal position, leave aside the partisanship, where the liberal position was more popular and specific, there was a headwind against us, which was the general view that you looked at the overall economy and the class warfare was a bad thing. And that's now reversed. There will now be going forward a general predisposition. The argument will begin with the notion that more attention has to be paid to increasing the extent to which that new wealth is shared better than it has. It will have one very specific, it's already had one very specific relevance, which I want to talk about for the rest of this, which some people here may be less happy about, but I'm not now in Congress and I don't have the day-to-day information that I used to have, but I'm pretty sure of this. I do not see how the legislation implementing the Trans-Pacific Partnership can pass. It is a casualty of this notion. Now, it's not just the political culture has changed. I've been struck by a change in the economics profession. Once again, for me 20 years ago, it was frustrating that even many liberal economists would somewhat patronizingly, I must tell you, say to us, well, yes, we understand you good liberals want to go out and help the poor people, but you know that minimum wage, that can do more harm than good. It was certainly not intellectually respectable 30 years ago, the minimum wage. In addition, we were told that trade was, after all, a pretty good thing, and that this pandering to special interest protectionism by being worried about the impact of trade wasn't very good, and there was a kind of a fairly casual assumption, oh yeah, well, we'll take care of those people. We'll have trade adjustment assistance. I am not a theologian, but I believe if you looked at some of the people that I once represented who had been engaged in some of these industries where they were hurt by imports, that getting into heaven for them would probably have been easier than getting trade adjustment assistance. And that's also changed. I was particularly struck in reading, I don't know, you get a little behind, but either the previous week's issue or 2 weeks ago issue of The Economist, acknowledging that this, they call themselves a newspaper, I don't know why what we think is a magazine is to them a newspaper, but whatever, they can call themselves whatever they want. But they acknowledge that they have seriously underestimated two things. First of all, the extent to which trade has contributed, not as the major factor, but has contributed to the erosion of wages for people in certain categories, particularly manufacturing, but also, and even more so, they've wildly overestimated the extent to which the people who lost their jobs would get the new jobs that were being created. And as I was in a discussion the other day, and I had to say that the assumption that 58-year-old coal miners in West Virginia were going to succeed as programmers in computers was pretty unrealistic. And I think this is part of it. The economics profession now understands, and of course the answer with trade is that it does good things and it does some bad things. It's a rule of American politics, it may be others, that basically the producer interest is politically, people complain about the special interest if it was some malignant factor. What it is the way human nature works here and probably elsewhere, namely that producer politics outweighs consumer politics most of the time because people get most of their income by one form. What they produce gives them one form of income. Their consumer income is widely spread. So most people are more easily organized in defense of the harm that may come to them as earners than they are in defense of the benefit they would get as consumers. Professor at Yale named Robert Dahl wrote about this years ago, calling it the intensity factor in politics. It is often the case when you look at public opinion polls that the side that has the majority in the public opinion poll has much less political influence, not for any malign reason, but because the minority of people on the one side care much more deeply than the majority of people on the other side, and they're the ones who contact their legislators. The best example of that is the single pound for pound, person for person, most influential political organization in America today. It's the National Rifle Association, and it's not because they give a lot of contributions. Frankly, the most important constituents of the National Rifle Association are on the whole working class, lower middle class people. What the NRA does is when a bill is going to come up that would interfere with their right to have these massively destructive weapons with very little check, have everybody who's in the organization write to their representatives and senators and call them and say, don't do that. And the great majority of people think it would be a good idea to pass the law, but they're busy with other things. But that's where we are in many cases, and we're now there in trade. Yes, a lot of Americans benefit from the lowering of prices from trade. But the number of people who are convinced that they have lost income because of it, and that number is, I agree, more than in fact who have, has now become very powerful. Now, that's operated for a while, but there was an offset. The general cultural views do have an impact. And in fact, for a while, trade got by, even though there were a lot of people unhappy about it and could look at what it did economically, because it was the right thing to do. Respectable opinion. And that counts for a lot. People like to be respectable. People like to think, particularly a lot of middle class people will do that. What's now changed is that the New York Times, the Economist, other voices of opinion that enlightened middle class and upper middle class opinion look to, have now said, yeah, we are on the whole in favor of trade, but it does have these negatives. And that's what you see this year. I mean, people say, well, it's going to get ratified after the election. I don't see how people can look at the progress of both Senator Sanders and Donald Trump and the extent to which those running against them have moved towards them on the trade issue and have any sense that this is going to get ratified. And let me refute the hyper and inaccurate, cynical view that, oh yeah, that's just until the election. Once the election is over, they'll all vote that way. One of the things people should understand in the modern communications era with the internet and everything else, the phrase, it's an election year, is now obsolete. It is always an election year because people, maybe it used to be that you could say something in February of the odd year and people will have forgotten it by November of the even year. But it'll be on YouTube. It'll be repeated. I mean, I have been told, we're being videotaped here, but I've gone to some groups and people say, well, this one's off the record. Yeah, off the record is when I talk to my husband when one of us is getting out of the shower. Anything else, I will not say anything to almost anybody if I'm not prepared to, I used to say read in the paper, but that shows how old I am, if I'm not prepared to have it trumpeted on the internet. The general respectability of the argument that the shares of income, and I would say politically, not necessarily economically, but politically, the question of how income is distributed has become far more potent than the question of growth. If you had to choose, if you were a politician today, would you take credit for adding 0.5% to GDP, or would you rather take credit for altering by a couple of percentage points the shares of income as they go to the people, and you'd rather do the latter from the purely political standpoint? So I'll make this prediction. The trade bill is not going to get implemented in its current form. Now, I do believe that trade properly done makes sense. So I have a proposal. I've written to the president about it, or I did an open letter. Trade is only going to come, and I think those of us who believe that shares, that the distribution is an important point, the only way you're going to get a trade bill passed. Implementing this one or going further is to make a deal. And the deal has to be this. I'm a great supporter of President Obama. I did have this one criticism. He said that with regard to trade, he said, I acknowledge that there'll be people who are going to get hurt. But I'm in favor of helping them, not just by trade adjustment assistance narrowly, but by supporting labor unions, by the minimum wage increase, by a massive construction project for infrastructure that will put people back to work. So yes, much of what the president says he wanted to do would help alleviate the negative distributional effects on some people of a trade bill. His mistake, though, was to say he was going to do them one after another. That first he was going to do the trade bill, and then he would do the other. And my criticism was that he was conferring on the people who were most in favor of the trade bill, the business community on the whole, a favor without asking them for anything in return. That is, the elements in the American economy that have been the most strongly in favor of expanded trade are the ones who are also most determined to break unions, oppose a minimum wage increase, cut back on other programs, reduce Social Security, it's called controlling entitlements, basically dealing with all those free-spending 82-year-old women who are rolling apparently in somebody's idea of luxury. What I would hope the president would do, and if not this president, the next president, if she's inclined to do trade, is to go to people in the more reasonable part of the business community and say, okay, here's the deal. We can have a trade bill, but here are the things that have to be in it. Not, we'll go first and then you'll give me that. So I predict you're going to see after the election, and I expect at this point, given the way it works, the likeliest thing is that Hillary Clinton will be president. And there'll be a good Democratic majority in the Senate, more Democrats than there now are in the House. Many, and I'm hoping, by the way, I'll be partisan now. I'm looking for two results in November. One, a Democratic working majority, but two, a Republican Party responsible conservative leadership that now understands that they waited too long to take their party back from some of the people who were more extreme. But at any rate, I do think trade will be on the agenda next year, but it will only be done, there will only be a movement in trade if there is a package of measures that expand trade and at the same time deal with what is now widely acknowledged by economists, by others, of a negative impact on some people in a way that diminishes distribution. So that I think is it's clearly a factor in this year's politics. People haven't noticed it yet, but I think once the election is over, people are going to see it. Now with that, I'm going to throw this open for questions or comments. I have the suspicion that there may be some topics other than the one I talked about that people may have on their mind. They may want to still talk about financial reform or the election or whatever. Please feel free, and let me just say, for some reason, moderators sometimes say, well, please put it in the form of a question. I never understood that. It is no harder for me to respond to a comment than to respond to a question. And if people want to make a comment and have me not respond, that's good too. So, yes?
Yeah, just the process of TPP is already gone through fast track, hasn't it?
Yeah, but now the legislation implementing it has to go. That is, it's a two-step. Mm-hmm. First, the president gets the authority to negotiate. What he has gotten is the authority to negotiate a deal, and what fast track means is that deal then comes before the Congress for ratification. Both houses have to vote for it, but they cannot amend it. So that they cannot, going back to 100 years ago when this group got the sugar tariff raised, et cetera, et cetera. So the bill, the deal does not go into effect unless it is passed by both houses of Congress. And that's not going to happen without some substantial changes.
That's not breaking the deal with the other countries, though?
Who made the deal with the other countries?
Well, the administration.
Okay, and who's got to pass the bill?
The Congress.
Okay, what was the question? I mean, the fact is no. And by the way, in the current mood,
right,
if you want to undermine a bill
right,
that you're trying to get passed, go to the United States House of Representatives and say, please, we owe this to Indonesia. You got to do this for Japan. You got to do this. Do you want me to lose credibility with Japan? So that's the political reality. But also, in fairness to the members of Congress, there's a little bootstrapping going on here. If you go back, TPP, Fast Track Authority, is sold on the premise that you were giving us the right to make a deal, but you have the right to say yes or no to the deal. Having gotten the bill through on that basis, it is really not legitimate, not intellectually decent to go back and say, oh, now you got to do it. That's the glitch that they have. But it's also the case that worrying about this is not going to be, the economic reality will be there. Yes, ma'am.
We've been working here for 2 days, and I haven't heard any discussion of the Panama Papers. And I was wondering if you would like to comment on how that might impact or not the implementation of Dodd-Frank.
Well, I don't see it as having a major effect. It may, I will say this, I think some of the panelists underestimated the extent to which the kind of political, cultural change I am talking about has made it easier to get the bill implemented. There's no question that those who are trying to slow it down are at risk. I would say this, it depends on the next election. If the Democrats win the next election, and I think that means Hillary Clinton, I think you're going to see a lot of the resistance to the financial reform bill diminish. Hope still is alive that they can roll it back. But one more 4 years, and I think rational people in the business community are going to understand, no, this is going to get too deeply involved. To the extent that the Panama Papers have an impact, it will be to say, see what's going on. It will strengthen the political hand of those who want to be tough. I must say, it's an interesting fact that there do not appear to have been any Americans involved. I was in Manhattan, almost feel the sigh of relief that that you got. But the other, what it will have an impact on is, and I believe again this is something behind the Democrats' agenda, changing the tax code to make it harder for American businesses to do things that reduce their United States tax obligation by relocating to some extent overseas, or not by relocating overseas, but by sending their mailing address overseas while remaining here. I think it will have some more impact. It will have some impact in this effort. You know, the administration recently announced tougher rules on inversions, and any chance that Congress was going to be able to cut those back, I think, was substantially diminished by the Messick Fonseca revelations. Yes, sir.
Mr. Frank, there's a narrative out there that's been out there since the financial crisis that links you to the GSEs in a way that contributed to the financial crisis. And are you familiar with that narrative? And
yep.
Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah, it is absolutely the opposite of the truth. I will recommend the appendices in my book. Here is what you have. It was, well, I'll first give you the history. Yes, obviously a major factor in the financial crisis were loans being made to people for mortgages being given to people who shouldn't have gotten them. And the right-wing narrative is, well, it's because liberals made banks lend money to poor people. One of the things they cite is the Community Reinvestment Act. I will tell you there was not a respectable opinion on that one. Even the Republican members of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission repudiated that. The Community Reinvestment Act has nothing to do with the quality of loans. The other argument is that we pushed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac into it. And I was, in 2003, wrong about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, too optimistic. But specifically, what I was saying at the time was that the bad loans being made for mortgages were not sufficient to pull down the full operation. My major focus then, there's a famous quote about rolling the dice, it was to do more in multifamily housing. And by the way, the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac multifamily unsubsidized housing portfolio always made money, was never in trouble. And in fact, my position was that we should be doing more rental housing as an alternative to home ownership for people who couldn't afford it. And I was always skeptical of the notion that we're going to get poor people to own homes. I mean, it's almost definitional. If you live in New York and you own a home, you're not poor. It's kind of hard to maintain both being poor and owning a home in New York, unless you were talking about a massive level of subsidy. Here is the history. Liberals, on the whole, became aware that there were abuses in the mortgage process. I'm not claiming prescience that's not justified. It wasn't because we saw this precipitating a crisis. It was as a consumer protection. In 1994, which was the last year the Democrats had both houses of Congress, before the Republicans took over 12 years, Democrats passed a bill, Homeowners Equity Protection Act, HOEPA was the ugly acronym. And it gave the Federal Reserve the power to regulate mortgages to prevent them from being given to people who shouldn't own them. Obviously, we were already under the influence of securitization, which, as was discussed in the panel, took away the lender's incentive to be careful. Alan Greenspan, and he's later admitted he was wrong about this, said, no, I'm not going to use those powers. He declined to use the powers. He said, leave it to the market. When that happened, some states then decided on their own to regulate the granting of subprime mortgages, including Georgia. It wasn't all just liberal states. At that point, the major lending institutions and the small ones went to the George W. Bush administration and said, you can't have this. So George W. Bush, through his control of the currency, Jerry Clark, who was a Clinton holdover, but this was a Bush policy, used the federal powers of preemption and put out an order that said no state could regulate the banking activities of any nationally chartered bank. That is, the states could enforce the building code, but they could not regulate anything about banking. So in that one gesture, the Bush administration prevented any state from regulating these. Many of us in Congress tried to stop that, but we didn't have the votes. The Republicans were running Congress. In fact, the control of the currency at that point sent out a DVD to state-chartered banks saying, hey, why don't you switch your charter to me, because then you can't be subject to these pesky kind of laws. It was sort of Thomas à Becket with the control of the currency as the king and the states as Thomas. So then we tried to pass a federal law to regulate and stop these mortgages. And I'm going to give you a little homework. The Democrats took over Congress in the 2006 election. In 2007, I became the chairman of the committee, and one of the things I did was to move a bill to prevent these subprime mortgages. So I refer you to the November 7th, 2006 editorial in the Wall Street Journal, in which I am harshly criticized for interfering with the market and preventing these minorities from getting loans. And an extraordinary, I make them very angry, and sometimes they lose it when you get too angry. The lead line in the editorial was, why is Mr. Frank picking on these? They are doing very well. 80% of them are paying on time. How's that for a good banking loan statistic? 80%, I mean, you go back, so they blocked us. We weren't until 2009 able to stop them. So there was a consistent record on the part of the conservatives blocking us from trying to get things done. We got the bill through in the House, we were able to block it in the Senate. Now with regard to the GSEs, it is true there was a time, I agree, we did not understand the extent to which the problems which we saw in subprime mortgages, single family, were going to hurt everybody else. But here's the deal on who's responsible for the failure to act on GSEs. The Republican Party controlled both houses of Congress from 1995 through 2006. They didn't do anything. In 2005, actually, the Republican chairman of the committee, a man named Mike Oxley, who you will know from the Sarbanes-Oxley law, did get a bill through the House to regulate Fannie and Freddie. Secretary of Treasury liked it. The Bush administration thought it didn't go far enough, so the Republican Senate rejected the Republican House bill. Oxley tried to get the president to intervene. Oxley's quote in the Financial Times, I think the raciest they've ever had, was, the bill lost because George Bush gave me the one-finger salute. But the fact is, from 1995 through 2006, nothing happened on the GSEs with the Republicans in control. Now, I was initially too slow to see that. By 2005, I was working with him. But then I refer you to Hank Paulson's memoir, and he says that in 2006, when he became Secretary of the Treasury, he called me up because it was clear that we were going to take over the House, and said, can you help us do a bill to regulate Fannie and Freddie? The first bill that passed the committee of any substance when I was chairman was the bill that Paulson asked for, putting Fannie and Freddie under constraints, and that's the one that finally was enacted in 2008 and put them in receivership. So that's the answer. It was the Republicans and the conservatives who insisted on protecting the right of institutions to make these loans and securitize them where people couldn't pay back. There was a bipartisan failure to see the problems in Fannie and Freddie, but it was the Democrats who finally looked into that and passed the bill. And I understand they've been very successful. And the thing is that they needed to do that. This notion that it was liberals' excessive indulgence towards poor people and minorities that caused the crisis was a clear effort to protect deregulation. It was the alternative explanation to the deregulation, actually non-regulation, because we didn't so much deregulate as not regulate new things, securitization, all those things. They came up and there were no regulations. And so this was a Republican, a conservative effort to say that it was the liberals who caused this and it was not a lack of regulation. And with regard to the Wall Street Journal, and they now thunder against these subprime loans. But go back and read them in 2006. And I've said, we've all known people who in their youth had an imaginary friend. With regard to subprime loans, the Wall Street Journal has an imaginary enemy. They imagine themselves as having been very much opposed to something which they staunchly protected. And I'm glad you asked me. Yes, sir.
As I mentioned in the panel, I had to do an article, I guess about a year and a half ago on Title 11 of Dodd-Frank. That was the Section 13.3 rewrite. Was there ever in the deliberations going into that any consideration given to just an outright repeal of 13.3 since the Fed, in my opinion, had heavily abused it? And the right answer is, as I said, do it through the Treasury, do it through...
Well, two things. Yes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no, but that's the general line of question. Was there
My
consideration of stronger measures than actually were taken in...
Two points.
11, yeah.
First of all, at one point, in fact, after and I'm not sure where the change came, but I at one point was on television and said, well, we repealed Section 13.3. That's the grant from the 30s that let the Fed basically do whatever they want. And the AIG thing is fascinating. AIG came to the Fed and said, we're $85 billion short of paying off our credit default swaps. And it was 2 days after Lehman, and Bernanke and Paulson, this is the key point, together said, yeah, we'll use the Fed authority to do the $85 billion. A week later, when when Bernanke was telling us how much they were going to need for the TARP, and enumerating so much for these banks, and they said $85 billion for AIG, and we said, oh no, you already told us about the $85 billion. The answer was, oh no, this is a second $85 billion. AIG was not only short of the money to pay off on its credit default swaps, they had literally no idea how much they owed. They were $170 billion short of paying off rather than 85. And we did, my first response was we were gonna repeal the whole thing. We were then prevailed upon, my colleagues were, I was the chairman, but I wasn't the king, that there needed to be some capacity. So the capacity that was there was some fight over this. Elizabeth Warren's been very helpful in this. What we said was the Fed could, if there was a liquidity crisis, set up a facility that could lend, but not just to one institution. In fact, the first they said two. We said, no, it's got to be at least five was the new rule. If there was an institution that was illiquid but solvent, they could make short-term loans. So, we might have been able to, the argument against it was there could be a kind of liquidity crisis. After all, the argument was that the failure of Lehman did cause a liquidity crisis for other institutions that were still solvent. The one area where I don't agree is, maybe it'll change in the future. And there was a time in the past when it would have been different. But in recent times, there has been a I don't know how many Star Trek people there are here, but there's been kind of a Vulcan mind meld of the Fed and the Treasury. It is at this point inconceivable that they will not differ with each other, and they only go ahead if they were both. And in fact, from my standpoint, and by the way, for those who wonder whatever happened to bipartisanship, the answer was Obama became president and did not get from the Republicans the cooperation we gave George Bush. In September of 2008, just before the presidential election, Bush sends Bernanke and Paulson to Harry Reid and Nancy Paulson, and as their deputies, Chris Dodd and myself, and says, we're in terrible trouble, and here's what you got to do. You got to do something that we think will be very helpful and enormously unpopular. And we did it. Frustrated, by the way, I did agree with you. Much too little was done to restructure existing loans, and I heard that part of it. That was my great frustration, because here was our choice. We wrote into the legislation an authorization to use some of the money to restructure the loans for individuals, and Paulson refused to use it. He's a very decent man. He said, I got to use every penny to keep the system going. And we had a major fight, little side effect on that. He then finally agreed. He only asked for the first $350 billion. He agreed to ask for the second $350 billion and use some of it for restructuring, diminishing the indebtedness. And he said, but this is now November. One of the significant things that needs to get more attention is that we worked out this crisis during the worst period to do anything, the interregnum, the lame duck period. We passed this thing in October, and it's implemented after the election when Obama's coming in. And Paulson did say to me, look, I'll ask for the more money, but I'm not going to do that without Obama's okay. And I went to Obama and said, would you let him do this? Were you okay him doing it? And it was a replay of the Roosevelt-Hoover thing, except they made it better by moving the turnover from March 4th to January 20th. That was a result of the Roosevelt-Hoover thing. But this was the only time I can think of since then where the fact that it happened in the lame duck period was a factor. And I asked Obama to please ask Paulson to release the money so he would use some of the money on mortgages. And the Obama people said, and I can understand, well, wait a minute, he has the authority to do it, right? He said he did. But he doesn't want to exercise that authority without your approval. And they said, well, look, he's running it, we can't run it. I don't want to get held responsible for something I'm not in charge of. Paulson said, yeah, well, I don't want to do something that people are going to say I should have waited for him. And the Obama people actually, to try and mollify me, said, after all, we only have one president at a time. And my public comment was that had overestimated the number of presidents we then had, and that was part of the problem. But that's along the side. The big issue was that Fed and Treasury on this worked so closely together that I don't think it would have, I know it wouldn't have made any difference then. Maybe that would in the future to do it, and I do agree that, but the other thing too is this. There was a time, maybe under Greenspan, when there was a kind of mystery around the Fed, that when you did something through the Fed, you were a little bit insulated. The political community could get insulated from some of the responsibility when it went through the Fed. That's over. There is now no more courage. And by the way, the thing that did it, it was alluded to, were the Aig bonuses. When the Aig bonuses were announced in this early spring, late winter of 2009, I have never seen the country so angry. I actually feared, it was like the Frankenstein movie, and people were out in the streets with the torches and the pitchforks. We actually passed a bill in the House retroactively taxing it away. It wasn't that the politicians were intimidated by it. It was constitutional. We have that problem. You cannot retroactively do these things. It cost Chris Dodd a chance to run for election if he'd wanted to, very unfairly. And at that point, I will tell you, I was looking, Bernanke says this in his memoir correctly. He'd been asking if I could support some more authority for the Fed. I guess they wanted to be more the lead guy in the FSOC. And he said, I reported to him that after the Aig bonuses, because it was after all the Fed that had paid the Aig debts, that there was no way that we would be lucky to keep the Fed out of prison. There was no way we could stand it. So that may be a point for the future. But the answer was, yeah, we did want to abolish the whole thing, and we were told, well, but then what happened was the Fed, which never liked losing 13.3, it was a great thing to have in its old form, did do a preliminary rule on the liquidity facility that was much too lax. And Elizabeth Warren, to our credit, raised hell with them, and they've tightened it up considerably, almost to the point where she's satisfied, which is a very elusive point. Yes?
Can you give us any background in terms of why they let Lehman go?
Yeah, very simple.
When they bailed out Bear Stearns
England.
and 2 days later, AIG?
No, it's a very good question. There was some speculation that it was because of Republican pressure. The Republican Party, particularly in the House,
They were the fact that Paulson was from Goldman Sachs.
no, it had nothing to do with that. Actually, Goldman probably would have been better off if being able to pay some of it. You know, I don't think Goldman ever really thought of Lehman Brothers as a real competitor. They were a little loftier than that. But and he did, after all, Goldman, Paulson, to his credit, they engineered the Bear Stearns takeover, and he engineered and encouraged Bank of America to buy Merrill Lynch, the one thing Ken Lewis did that people liked. He then followed that up by buying Countrywide, which was about the stupidest thing that any financial executive ever did, and the bank suffered, and that's what toppled him. But there was a lot of Republican attack on Paulson and Bernanke for Bear. And so the Republicans said no more bailouts. And in fact, in the Republican platform of 2008, it said no bailouts. And one argument is that Paulson allowed Lehman to go under because he was afraid of the criticism from the Republicans. I think that is, I know that's inaccurate for this reason. I happen to be in, starting in late 2007, all through 2008, I never had a good weekend, or maybe I'd have every occasion a good weekend. By the time I was chairman of the committee, generally around 4:30, 5 o'clock, after the markets closed, I would get a call from Paulson with more bad news. This is failing, that's failing, they waited in to announce it. And I was at a fundraiser in Manhattan over that weekend when it failed, and he called me several times. And the last call I got for him before I went home and went to bed was, I think it's okay, Barclays is going to take it over. Remember, he was out of American banks to do it. Bank of America had bought Merrill, JP Morgan Chase had bought Bear, Wells Fargo had bought Wachovia, and Citicorp needed somebody to buy it. Nobody thought Citicorp at that point could buy anybody. So he then turned to Barclays. And I know it was Sunday night, I think, he thought he had the deal with Barclays. And the Financial Services Authority in England said, no, you're not sending us that problem. And they vetoed it. And I woke up the next morning to learn that, and I was at a session of the Institute at the Kennedy School, where the guy who was then the deputy head of the Bank of England, who was at the Kennedy School because he didn't get to be the head, said, yeah, that was the case. So in fairness to Paulson, he was prepared to do it. Now, a number of the free market, pure free market Republicans felt vindicated by that. And in fact, and again, Ben Bernanke quotes in the book, so they said, let it fail. You know, let's show this. Well, almost everybody was stunned that the consequences of the Lehman failure were greater than they thought. And as Bernanke notes, that was on Monday. By Wednesday, they were responding to AIG, and I announced that I was going to file a bill to declare that Monday Free Enterprise Day, because it was the one day in American history when we had, in fact, free enterprise, but we decided we didn't really like it that much. Well, I thank you all. This has been very enjoyable. Thank you.